Hey, it's Silver, and this is Zoeti? I'm actually not sure how you say it. I'm going to go with Zoeti. This is a turn-based RPG that looks a bit like a deck builder at first because it involves cards and things, but it's actually not really. The way it works is you choose from 3 different classes, which are actually full characters that have their own personalities and things. They're not just classes. And you go on an adventure. And the way the adventuring works is a little bit different because it looks at first like a bit of a Slay the Spire type of map layout where you have a map composed of different nodes that you go between, and each node is connected to other ones, so you have to, branch your way through your adventure by choosing node after node. But the way that Slay the Spire works is one really large map for each level, and then after you beat the final boss, you move on to the next big map. This is a little bit different. They're not really large maps. Instead, it's a series of small, sort of connected narrative stories that each have their own mini-map. So just one quest, one story of this game can take like 10 minutes to finish or so. They're really bite-sized little maps. But they are fully featured little maps as well. They do have all the various different types of nodes that you would expect, from enemy nodes to rest nodes to events to special other things you can find in shops and campsites, stuff like that. So there's definitely a lot of similarities to the way that the traditional deck builder works. But when we get into the combat, well, it's not really the same at all. The way the combat works is you have a hand of normal poker cards, and unlike something like Aces and Adventures, it's not really based on poker hands specifically as much as it's based on these skill slots. So every character has several different slots of skills, and the slots are all named after different types of cards, right? So the single slot is just one card, any card, it doesn't matter what it is, whereas the 2 pairs slot is obviously you got to have at least 2 pairs to play that particular skill. And there's a skill slot for pretty much each different type of valid hand. And every class has entirely different skills from every other class. There are no shared skills at all, so they all play completely differently. And you don't have any kind of action point style of system or mana or anything like that in this game. You can actually play as many cards as you have. However, you do have a hand limit, as well as a number of cards that you will draw every turn. So you don't necessarily want to completely empty your hand every single time, because that will leave you with only the cards that you draw next turn to make something out of. And it would be nice if you instead got a little closer to your normal hand cap by leaving a couple of cards, because the hand does stay in between turns, so that when you actually get into the next turn, the cards you draw will be added to the ones you already had and give you more chance to have more possibilities to actually use that turn. Enemies do show you their intents above their head in classic Slay the Spire style, so you always know what in general they're going to do. You don't necessarily know everything exactly, but for the most part you know how much damage they're about to do and things like that. So it's very much a game of looking at the cards that you currently have in your hand and trying to decide what the best sequence of actions to be to protect yourself from whatever they're about to do, and also deal out some damage yourself to get closer to defeating them. And usefully enough, the game actually does display all of the different things above your cards that you can actually do that turn. So you don't have to know poker really well or anything like that. You can just look at the icons for each of your skills and they'll just pop up. So if you happen to have a 3 of a kind in your hand, then the 3 of a kind skill will pop up showing you that you can make one. And if you want to, you can just click the skill and it will automatically select the 3 cards that will make it, and then you can just drag them up to use it on whatever enemy is targeted. So you don't necessarily have to pick out the individual cards yourself if you don't want to. The game does expedite that process a little bit. If you're doing a whole bunch of different attacks in one turn, it might be handy to just be able to click these buttons instead of individually leafing up every card. In terms of the skill variety, this is where the game really shines. There's a lot of different skills to choose from. Every character has a whole bunch of different ones. There are always more than one skill for each slot. So, your single slot, you'll start with 2 different ones to choose from, whereas your, say, 4 of a kind slot will be empty at first. You'll have to actually beat a couple of battles in order to find a 4 of a kind skill to actually put in there, but there will be more than one different 4 of a kind skill for every class to choose from. So this means you're encouraged to just go to your preparation menu in between battles and look at all the various skills you have for each slot and actually compose a build that synergizes well together. So you want some defensive stuff, some offensive stuff, maybe some buffs and things like that, depending on what class you're playing. You want a good variety of things that you can perform in each combat to make sure you can handle the various different scenarios you may come across. So you're always encouraged to look through this menu and equip what you feel is best together. For your first couple of combats, you will be gaining new skills, because every character starts with about half of their skill slots empty. So your first few combats will be actually finding skills that will go into those slots, but after you have all the slots filled, you'll start both finding new versions of skills to go in those slots and upgraded versions of the skills you already have. Also, in the name of upgrades, every time you complete a combat or kill enemies, you get these shards of crystal, and whenever you find a rest location, you can choose to upgrade one of the cards you have if you have enough crystals to do so. So upgrading the cards is very important. The enemies do get stronger over the course of the adventure that you're in, so you will want more powerful cards, and the upgrades are pretty significant. Every card can be upgraded up to 4 times. Level 4 is max for each one. And they tend to add a lot of extra numbers, whatever it is they do, it just makes them better at it. And sometimes they also add some extra buffs or debuffs to them and some other things of that nature. So it's definitely a good idea to pick out specific skills that you want to rely on and keep on your bar, and then upgrade those to be more and more effective. At the end of each of these mini-maps, there will be a boss of some sort to fight, and the story is present. It's actually a relatively narratively focused game, so there are cutscenes, there's dialogue, there's a before-boss dialogue for every single boss that's unique to each one. It is not a procedurally generated adventure in that sense. There are actually characters and beginnings and ends and different conversations to see in the end and stuff like that. There's quite a bit to the game in terms of its story because it is a more narratively focused adventure. However, there is also an adventure mode. Once you complete this main quest line for the first time, you'll get an adventure mode which is more like your traditional Slay the Spire, larger map kind of dungeon crawl experience. Every time you beat the boss of one of the adventures, you will go back to the inn, and the inn allows you to upgrade one of your cards just like resting at a camp does, but it also allows you to rest and heal for like twice as much as a normal camp, so it's a really good source of healing, and that does mean, by the way, that your health is persistent across your entire adventure. So if you get hurt a whole bunch in the first one, you rest up at the end, you might still not be at full health for the second one, so you do have to be careful about trying to take as little damage as possible because you don't get fully healed in between each map. There are also a lot of items for you to gather, many different items, all having their own passive effects, just like a Slay the Spire style of experience, and these tend to be quite potent, honestly. You can have a lot of them too. As far as I can tell, there isn't really even like a normal limit. You can stack up tons and tons of these items, and you will have a bunch of them by the end of the main adventure, because you'll find them after certain battles, you'll find them after completing certain maps, you'll find them in certain events. They're all over the place, really, and it's always a good thing to try and build yourself up as much as possible, because a lot of these are so potent that you want specific ones depending on your class and your build at that particular time to help make yourself stronger. There are also consumable items. You can hold, as far as I can tell, as many of these as you want, but you can only bring 3 of them into battle at any given time, although there are a couple of other slots that say they are unlockable, but I'm not sure how you do it yet. So it does seem that there might be up to 5 item slots, but first you'll start with 3. And there are, of course, quite a large variety of consumable items to actually use, and there are even some relics, some artifacts you can get that give you a repeated supply of consumable items depending on certain specific requirements. There are 2 different types of shops in the game. You gain these sand coins from defeating enemies as well as from completing certain events or completing maps. And this is your main sort of gold currency. And there's a shop next to the inn that you can go to before you actually start your next adventure. However, this shop is a bit limited. It contains a selection of some random consumable items as well as some relics. However, these relics are not the same as the normal ones that you get because these actually break after a certain number of uses. They tend to be pretty powerful, but yeah, they are temporary. They will break after they do whatever it is they do a certain number of times. However, you can also find a different shop while you're actually adventuring when you're on one of the small maps. And this shop tends to be more expensive, but actually has permanent relics, the kind that you can find as rewards and stuff. So it's often worthwhile to try and save up some of the coins to find one of these shops while adventuring, because they tend to have some really nice things that you might actually want. And by the way, the game does get pretty hard, I've got to say. The first couple of adventures are not particularly challenging. They do a good job of teaching you how to play, right? But they're not like super hard. But then after you get to like the 3rd boss or so, things start to get much more difficult, and you start to get to enemies that have energy shields and evasion techniques and some other things of that nature that make them much, much harder to deal with. And then, of course, the idea is to get to the end of the adventure and then unlock more stuff to do. There is a fair amount of content in the game because of the fact that there's like this narrative adventure and then there's this adventure mode separate from that you unlock later, and some other stuff to unlock as well. Because each of the 3 characters that you can play has their own experience gauge, then you will gain experience just from going through adventures with them. And as you level up each character, you get some new possible skills that you can find while playing as that character that'll be distributed in the loot, as well as sometimes some new artifacts and things that unlock as well that you'll be able to find for anyone. So this is a really solid twist on the deck builder format that does things very differently, but it also does have a couple of issues. For one, I find it kind of unnecessary that every single time you start an adventure, it makes you click through all the tutorial pop-ups again, as if it was the first time you were playing. It's nice to have the tutorial for each of the characters that tells you what they're all about and stuff like that, but you don't need it every single time you start a run. And then there's the worry of the balance, because of course in a game that is based on poker cards, RNG is going to be in full effect, so you never know what you're going to draw and what of your skills you're going to be able to use that particular turn. You're sort of trusting in the heart of the cards, as it were, so you gotta just sort of hope that you get what you need. And for the most part, the different skills are varied enough to help you work around the idea of RNG so that it doesn't feel too random, right? It doesn't feel like you had no choice in whether you won or lost. But I do think there are a few certain enemy types that really strain this a little bit. Mostly it's the enemy types with evasion. Evasion is a very powerful effect. It evades up to 10 damage per stack, and it stacks pretty much infinitely as far as I can tell. So if an enemy has, say, 4 evasion, you have to waste enough attacks on them to actually get rid of those 4 evasions before you can even start to do damage to them, but you also have to be defending from the damage that they're doing, which means you probably don't have enough cards in your hand to be able to both get rid of their evasion efficiently and actually start damaging them and make sure you don't take any damage yourself. This means that when it comes to certain enemy types, the idea of RNG does kind of rear its ugly head a little bit, because there are some where it kind of feels like you just need to get a little bit lucky to be able to beat them without getting hurt too much, because they're just so difficult to hit normally, or they're so difficult to defend against because they do so much damage so quickly, or something like that. Some sort of excessive amount of a certain stat can cause some enemies to need a little bit more luck than I would like to be able to reliably or efficiently take them down, because you only have a certain hand size, you can only draw a certain number of cards per turn, so you're not always guaranteed to have everything you need to actually deal with certain enemies when it comes to these specific ones that have some sort of gimmick that make them really, really hard, like a ton of evasion or a ton of regenerating energy shield or something like that. But even though I think the game could use a little bit of a balance pass when it comes to the later content, I also have had a really fun time playing this game, and I think the variety in classes is definitely its strong suit. Because each of the 3 classes plays entirely differently from one another, it's fun to just try them out and see which one you gel with, and the fact that each class has quite a large variety of different skills to choose from means you can try all kinds of different builds for each one, so there's a ton of player variety. So I think with a little bit of extra attention to how some of the late game stuff goes in terms of some, RNG fighting mechanics, I think there's a really solid game here underneath just a little bit of frustration that occasionally happens. It's still very much worthwhile and a really enjoyable time, and I very much love the mage in this game. By the way, the mage is really fun to play. All of her fire, lightning, and ice juggling is really fun to do, although she is ridiculously fragile because she has like less than half the health of the main original character that you start with. So she is hard to play, but very fun, and that's kind of what makes the game shine to me, is because of the large variety in skills you can find, it means that it's fun to do that experimentation and find those characters that are difficult but enjoyable because of all the various builds you can make with them. And I think actually if this game had a little bit of modding support, that would go a long way. The ability to make your own different versions of attacks for the existing characters, or maybe even the ability to make your own entirely new characters, would be really, really cool, and it would definitely benefit the game's longevity. I have no idea if that's something that they have really thought about, but it would be very cool. So I will link you, as I always do, in the description below this video to the Steam store page for the game if you wish to check it out yourself. It's a pretty good time. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.